Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone for this session webinar of the Darwin Club for Social Science. Very pleased and privileged to have with us today Cecilia Hayes from Oxford, and she's going to talk about cultural evolutionary psychology, and I think the clue there is in the first word and the title as well as the other words. Very interested in your argument, as Cecilia, and welcome, and please start with your talk.
Fine, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this group. Among other things, it gives me an opportunity to get out a couple of photographs that I took in 1990 when I visited Darwin's home, Down House in Kent, with a mentor of mine, a very distinguished social psychologist and evolutionary epistemologist called Donald T. Campbell. I mean, I say that we visited, but really it was more of a pilgrimage for both of us to the great man's house. At that time, I was a cognitive psychologist with an interest in evolution. I had not yet heard of evolutionary psychology, but not long after that visit to Down House, I came to know and to admire the work of evolutionary psychologists Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, and Steven Pinker. That work, I think, was very important because at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, for the first time, it combined Darwinian thinking with computational psychology. So previous efforts in the same direction, sociobiology, ethology, had tended to treat the mind like a black box, or to use, as it were, everyday folk psychology to talk about the causes of behavior. But Cosmides, Tooby, and Pinker made a concerted effort to bring together Darwinian thinking with the computational view of the mind, essentially the model of the mind dominant still in contemporary psychology that views the mind as software running on the brain. And more specifically, they claimed that humans have a large number of innate modules, or what Pinker called cognitive instincts, that what makes our minds different from those of other animals, and therefore our lives so very different from those of other animals, are a set of special purpose modes of thought, each of which is genetically inherited. And they were called innate modules or cognitive instincts. Cosmides, Tooby, and Pinker focused on two cognitive instincts, Cosmides and Tooby on social exchange reasoning, sometimes called cheater detection, which they understood to be a special purpose mode of thought, which was a kind of an adaptation for reciprocal altruism, a way that enabled people to detect and enforce fair and unfair exchanges. And Pinker, building on the work of Noam Chomsky, focused on language, which of course he saw as an adaptation for communication. Now, in the ensuing years after the early 1990s, this kind of thinking, the idea of cognitive instinct, was embraced by quite a few psychologists, especially developmental psychologists, and the putative list of distinctively human cognitive instinct got longer. So not only social exchange reasoning and language. Oh, by the way, are you able to see my cursor on your screens?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we can see.
Great. Okay. So not only social exchange reasoning and language, but also other cognitive instincts added to the list included mathematical cognition, teaching, imitation, mind reading, also known as theory of mind or mentalizing, the capacity to predict the behavior of others by ascribing to them thoughts and feelings, beliefs and desires. What's known as mental time travel, the capacity to think about specific episodes in the past and to plan the future. Spatial mapping of the physical environment. Selective or strategic social learning, the kind of social learning where you work out when it's best to do it and from whom you should do it. Causal cognition, thinking about causation in the physical world. Normative or moral reasoning, thinking about what's right and wrong. And metacognition, which is roughly thinking about thinking. So there was enthusiasm for cognitive instincts within psychology, but also more broadly among social scientists, especially Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, who were at that time developing mathematical models of cultural evolution. And later, Dan Sperber, also a cultural evolutionist, and Joe Henrich, who is perhaps now the most prominent contemporary proponent of what's known as the California School of Cultural Evolution, founded by Boyd and Richardson. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for these cognitive instincts. But in the ensuing 30, 35 years, this idea of cognitive instincts has encountered some very significant empirical problems. I'm calling the view that the human mind is made up of cognitive instincts, coming from Cosmides, Tooby, and Pinker originally, classical evolutionary psychology. And I'm going to focus on the empirical problems that it's had, because I think there are still many social scientists who are unaware of these problems. Classical evolutionary psychology gets a lot of press, and a lot of it is quite good press outside psychology, but inside it is seen to be deeply problematic. And I want to give you a sense of why. And those problems are in a way what motivate the alternative approach, which I'm going to recommend, which I call cultural evolutionary psychology. I probably should have thought of a name which would give it a different acronym, but we won't dwell on that. Now, let's start with those foundational cognitive instincts. Social exchange reasoning, worked on by Cosmides and Tooby, and language, worked on by Steven Pinker. Social exchange reasoning, there were some exciting experiments in the late 1980s done by Cosmides and Tooby, which showed that people are a lot better at conditional reasoning when problems are presented to them in a concrete social way rather than in an abstract way. So in their experiments, the abstract version might look like this. The volunteer in the experiment is presented with 4 cards marked E, K, 4, and 7. And they're asked, which of those cards must you turn over in order to test the rule? If there's a vowel on one side of the card, then there should be an even number on the other side of the card. Now, presented in this abstract way, most participants weren't very good at it. They tended to know that they must turn over the card with the vowel on it, but they very often overlooked that they must also turn over the card with an odd number on it in case it had a vowel on the other side. But on the other hand, if they were presented with logically the same problem, but it was framed in a social contract or social exchange kind of way, then their performance was much better. So say the rule they had to test was, if a person is drinking alcohol, then they must be over 18. And the cards would have beer, Coca-Cola, 16 and 21 years old on them, then they would readily identify that they had to turn over two cards, the equivalent of the vowel and the odd number. That led Cosmides and Tubi to argue that we have a special purpose, mental process for social exchange reasoning, for detecting cheaters on a social contract. And that this cognitive instinct is genetically inherited. You've got the seeds of it when you're born. It's part of your genetic inheritance, and it just unfolds in the course of childhood. But as early as 1989, Cheng and Holyoake were saying, well, no, actually, we might be better at the social version of these conditional reasoning problems just because we've had more practice, because they're more familiar to us than problems which involve vowels and odd and even numbers and so on. And they and others did experiments showing that there is good performance on this kind of conditional reasoning problem, not only when it's couched in terms of a social contract, but also when it's couched in terms of a prudential rule, but also the kind of rule which is very familiar in our everyday lives. So say the rule is, if a gun is in the house, then it should be unloaded. Or if you're working with a toxic gas, then you should wear a mask. These are not social exchange problems, and therefore should be outside the remit of a cognitive instinct for social exchange reasoning, but people's performance is just as good as it is on social exchange reasoning problems. Now, Cosmides and Tubi and their associates have responded to that by saying, well, there's two cognitive instincts. There's one for social exchange reasoning, and there's another for prudential reasoning, which of course may be true, but I think there's a lot of unease about this. People have the feeling that, well, if you can multiply cognitive instincts to save your data, then maybe the cognitive instinct idea is being used in a way which makes it untestable. So that's the empirical problems with one of the foundational cognitive instincts. What about the other one, language? There's now a large body of evidence, surprisingly, challenging the idea that humans are able to learn language because we are born with some innate knowledge of grammar or syntactic structure, basically the Chomsky idea. And I just want to give you one example of the kind of study that challenges that view. This is a study done by Kidd and Choli. And what they did was to give children 6 to 8 years old two kinds of problem. One of the problems had absolutely nothing to do with language. They asked children to remember the order in which aliens entered a spaceship. So the children saw a movie, they saw lots of aliens marching up to the spaceship and walking inside. And then they were asked afterwards, okay, which alien came first, and then who was next, and then who was next, and so on. In the other kind of problem, they were presented with sentences with relatively low frequency syntactic structures and asked to choose one of two pictures that matched the sentence. So in this example, they were asked, where is the mouse that is kissing the chicken? So of course, We all realize, I hope, that it's the one on the right rather than the one on the left. Now, what they found was that a very strong correlation between children's performance on the two tasks. If a child was good at encoding a sequence of aliens, they would also be good at interpreting this syntactic structure. And that suggests that they were using one kind of all-purpose sequence encoding mental mechanism for both tasks, rather than some kind of generic mechanism which encodes the sequences of changes in the inanimate environment, changes in positions of the body, and the order in which aliens enter a spaceship. It's inconsistent with the idea that they were using one mental process, a generic process for sequence encoding on this task, and on the other hand, using innate knowledge about grammar to help them on the other task. Now, that's just one example of the evidence which is stacking up against the idea that humans have, a cognitive instinct for language. There's an awful lot more. And on this slide and some of the subsequent slides, I both include a reference to the particular paper that I've talked about, in this case, the Kidnar-Chuli, and then also to something that I've written, which has looked much more broadly at the evidence on this issue. Okay, so that's the two foundational cognitive instincts, but the problems don't stop there. So, for example, they extend to mind reading, also known as theory of mind, our capacity to ascribe mental states to others. So for a long time, this was almost unanimously assumed to be a cognitive instinct, that humans genetically inherit a propensity to ascribe thoughts and feelings, beliefs and desires to themselves and to others, and by that route to be able to predict behavior. But the principal evidence in support of that view was studies of children suggesting that the capacity to read minds, ascribe mental states, develops in an invariant sequence. All children develop the capacity with its components in the same order, which of course sounds like the unfolding of a genetically inherited program with a little kind of feeding help from experience. But in recent years, there have been a lot of studies challenging this idea that mind reading develops in an invariant sequence. So one example one example was done by Shahanian and her colleagues, in which they compared children in Australia and Farsi-speaking children in Iran. Now, the children in Australia, like children in the US and in the UK and in most of Europe, develop a capacity to ascribe mental states in a fixed order. They understand first that people may want different things, have diverse desires. Then they begin to understand what's known as diverse beliefs. They begin to understand that people might have different beliefs about the same thing, and actually those beliefs might all be true. So it's like appreciating different opinions. Then they begin to understand knowledge access. If you've seen something, then you tend to know about it. If you haven't seen something, then you tend to be ignorant about it. And then they go on to the higher reaches of mind reading. They appreciate that people can have false beliefs, and that they can do things like hiding their emotions. But the striking result from this study was that two of the important components were in the opposite order for the children in Iran. They came to understand knowledge access before they were able to understand diverse beliefs. So this, along with a lot of other evidence, suggests that the capacity to ascribe mental states to oneself and others is not based on a genetically inherited program which just unfolds in an invariant order in the course of childhood, but rather that it's a capacity learned from other people by witnessing those other people ascribing mental states and talking about it. And that in a society where diverse beliefs, differences of opinion, are tolerated, celebrated, then that capacity comes first before understanding that if you see something, then you know it, and if you don't see it, you're unlikely to know it. Whereas in a society where diversity of belief is not something that's celebrated, but rather there's a broader understanding that there are people who know and others who don't know, then knowledge access, understanding of knowledge access comes first, and understanding of diverse beliefs only comes later. Another example, I'm having trouble moving along with my slides. Okay, morality. I think this one may interest you. So essentially the question here is, are we born with some knowledge of good and evil, of what's right and wrong? Is that a cognitive instinct? There was a study done in 2007 by Kylie Hamlin and Paul Bloom, among others, which is much celebrated and was widely interpreted as showing that indeed we are born with some kind of knowledge of the difference between good and evil. It was an ingenious study. What happened was that the child was shown, these were infants. These were infants 6 to 10 months old in this study. And they were shown little movies. And at the beginning of the movie, there was this kind of hillside on the screen. So let's take the right-hand panel of this figure. That's all that would be on the infant's screen. And at the beginning of the movie, they just saw a red circle with googly eyes. And the red circle came along here, continued, then started going up the hill and fell back down again. And that happened twice. They saw the red circle go up and then come down again twice. And then the red circle was joined on the screen. And they were joined on the screen either by a blue circle with googly eyes, a blue square with googly eyes, or a yellow triangle. If they were joined by a blue square, then after the joining, the two shapes both went back down to the bottom of the hill. If the red circle was joined by the yellow triangle, then the two of them went up the hill to the top. Now, Hamlin and colleagues called this the helper condition because certainly an adult looking at these videos couldn't resist thinking, you know, that sweet little yellow triangle, it saw the red circle trying to get up the hill, and it intervened and helped the red circle to get up there. Whereas the blue square is a hinderer. An adult looking at the movies thinks, you know, this blue square, it saw that the circle was trying to get up the hill and it just moved in to make sure it went back down again. After the infants had looked at these videos, they were then presented with a yellow triangle and a blue square in real life. And it was reported that they systematically reached for the helper rather than the hinderer, that they wanted to touch, they wanted to handle the yellow triangle rather than the blue square. And this was interpreted as evidence that infants as young as 6 to 10 months old understand something about helping and harming, and that they like helpers better than they like harmers. So this was being read as, these infants are not only capable of ascribing mental states and intentions to geometric figures, but also that they are moralistic about it. They don't just ascribe intentions, but they make moral judgments about those intentions. So a big claim, and you might have expected this big claim to come under very close scrutiny. But in fact, it was only this year that a study was published by Luca and colleagues, but that's a large number of colleagues. This study was done across many laboratories, this attempt at replication. It involved more than 1,000 infants, 5 to 10 months old, and it was not able to replicate the effect reported by Hamlin, Wynne, and Bloom. So in the crucial test, 49% of the infants preferred the helper to the hinderer. 51% preferred the hinderer to the helper. No difference. Now, I think you've probably had enough of me being a killjoy about these studies. So let me just say, although imitation is my favorite subject, but nonetheless, I just want to say, in case you've heard of some studies originally published in the 1970s, which seemed to show that newborn babies can copy facial expressions and hand movements fresh out of the womb, that they're capable of this imitation. Like with the evidence on infant morality, very recently, a large-scale study has shown that the effect cannot be replicated. There is now no reason to suppose that newborn babies can imitate, and therefore that a mental capacity imitation, which is widely understood to be an engine of cultural evolution, a kind of an analog of genetic inheritance, there's no reason to suppose that the potential for that is itself genetically inherited. A little pause. Now, I don't like being a killjoy, but I do think that it's important for people in social sciences more broadly to know that even though classical evolutionary psychology still gets a good press, as it were, that within cognitive and experimental psychology, it is no longer seen as kind of holding water. And many people conclude from that psychology doesn't need Darwinism. An effort was made to link the computational view of the mind, the idea that the mind is software running on the brain, to link that with Darwinian thought. It failed. Let's just ignore Darwin in future. I think that would be a mistake. And I think there is another way of bringing together Darwinism with computational psychology, a way that fits the data much better. And the alternative, I call cultural evolutionary psychology. Again, I'm having trouble moving my slides. Okay. And I just want to give you a flavor of this alternative kind of evolutionary psychology. It replaces the idea of cognitive instinct with the idea of cognitive gadgets. So what I'm suggesting is that the special purpose modes of thought that you find in humans, which are absent or present only in some trace form in other animals, that those distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are not like organs. They're not like, the heart, liver, lungs. They are more like instruments. Now, of course, organs are shaped by natural selection operating on genetic variants. But instruments, especially simple early instruments like spinning wheels and traps and canoes, bows and arrows, are products of cultural evolution, of natural selection operating on socially learned rather than genetically inherited variants. So the suggestion is that distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are more like instruments than organs, and therefore that the young children acquire these distinctively human cognitive mechanisms through interaction with adults, broadly by social learning. To be a little more specific in contrasting the instinct view, the classical evolutionary psychology, with the gadget view, cultural evolutionary psychology, they say different things both about childhood development and about evolution at the population level. So on the one hand, the instinct view, classical evolutionary psychology, assigns a pretty minor role to experience in the development of distinctively human modes of thinking. It casts experience as evoking or triggering the unfolding of a genetically inherited program for the development of a mode of thought. And on the evolution side, of course, it says that these programs have been shaped by natural selection operating on genetic variants, and that they are adaptations to human life in what's sometimes called the Pleistocene past or the Stone Age. In contrast, cultural evolutionary psychology assigns a dominant role to social experience in the development of distinctively human cognitive processes. It suggests that social learning constructs things like theory of mind, the capacity to imitate, language, morality. It constructs those mental capacities from old parts. Now, when I say old parts, I mean simpler modes of thinking, which we share with a wide range of non-human animals, and which are themselves genetically inherited. So the special purpose, distinctively human modes of thought are products of cultural selection rather than natural selection on genetic variants. But they are built from ways of thinking which are genetically inherited and are shared with a range of other animals. Just to make the idea of cultural selection in this context a little clearer, imagine there's a population where there is cognitive variability. So say, for example, the people in that population are using two different ways of predicting other people's behavior, two different ways, two different, let's call it theories of mind, or two different kinds of mind reading. Now, on the cultural selection view, the orange way of mind reading and the blue way of mind reading don't differ in fertility. So the gray circles represent biological offspring. And as you can see, the people who mind read in the orange way are not having more children than the people who mind read in the blue way. What happens is that the people who mind read in the orange way have more students. They are, as it were, more prolific teachers than the people who mind read in the blue way. And consequently, more people acquire the orange way of reading minds, and the orange way spreads within the population. Now, much of my work, I've put on the other slides some of the papers and the book in which I've reported this work, involves arguing that cognitive variation is better explained by cultural than by genetic inheritance. And that cognitive variation is of various kinds. It involves the differences between non-human and human minds. That's one dimension of variation. It includes the variation in thinking, which we witness as children grow up. Cultural variation in thinking, which is much more striking than I realized before I got involved in this project. And what's known in psychology as individual differences, which really means differences in thinking within a population, within a culture. You might say among subcultures. So what I do is I comb through the evidence from research on animal cognition, developmental psychology, cross-cultural research, and research on individual differences. And for each of the cognitive gadgets, I weigh it up and say, is that data better explained by assuming that we have a genetically inherited propensity which just unfolds in the course of development, or can we better explain that variation by ascribing it to opportunity for cultural learning of specified ways of thinking? But I want to make clear that I am not offering a blank slate view of the character of human minds. I think there is compelling evidence that we are able to download cognitive gadgets from the people around us, that we're able to socially learn these distinctively human modes of thought from other people, because natural selection operating on genetic variants has made the mind of a newborn baby a little bit different from the mind of a newborn chimpanzee. In particular, it has made small, that is genetic evolution, has made small quantitative changes in the course of hominin evolution to our temperaments, our attention, and our general purpose cognition. Specifically, it's made us more socially tolerant, more sensitive to social rewards. How other people treat us really matters to humans compared with chimpanzees, for example. On the attentional front, it's made us interested in faces and voices from the moment of birth. We prioritize those inputs. And it has expanded our capacity for associative learning, a very simple kind of learning, including reinforcement learning, and what's known as executive control, which includes our capacity to switch between tasks and our capacity to inhibit impulses. We're nearly at the end, but I still can't move the slides on easy. Ah, there we are. Okay. So just winding up, here again is that slide which contains all the putative cognitive instincts. What cultural evolutionary psychology suggests is that they are all cognitive gadgets shaped by cultural selection rather than natural selection. And in that respect, that they are all like literacy, the capacity to read and write. We know that the capacity to read and write could not be a product of natural selection operating on genetic variants, because it only emerged about 5,000 years ago. And there's a consensus that that's not long enough to produce a cognitive instinct for literacy, that it must instead be a product of cultural evolution. My suggestion is that the same is true for the other distinctively human cognitive mechanisms. And the implications of this view, I mean, if cultural evolutionary psychology is broadly right, then our minds are more fragile and more agile than classical evolutionary psychology, the cognitive instinct view, would suggest. So they're more fragile in the sense that if there was a kind of a global catastrophe, a pandemic worse than the one that we recently experienced, global war or climate breakdown, then distinctively human cognitive mechanisms could be lost. If there was a residual human population, they would have to culturally evolve again. On the cognitive instinct view, as it were, whenever a baby is born, they bring into the world with them these instincts to think in certain ways. So it's a more fragile view of what's distinctively human, but it also suggests that we're more agile than classical evolutionary psychology implied, that our minds are not adapted to the Stone Age, they are adapted to the lives of the people who lived not long ago in our own society, so that they are eminently, for good or ill, malleable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. That was absolutely fantastic, very stimulating. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
there's lots of discussion coming out of this.
Shall I unshare my slides?
No, just in case somebody wants to see something.
Okay,
Brian, do you
fine.
want to come in?
Yes, please. If I can kick off, it was a fantastic presentation, really fascinating. And I was really interested to see at the beginning you pointed to Steven Pinker, whose work I love, and I even picked up the reference to Blank Slate later on as well. I was interested. One of the debates, one of the criticisms of Steven Pinker's work, I think it's Stephen Mythen at Reading, is about the evolution of music, and Pinker called it auditory cheesecake, I think was the expression he used. I wondered if you had a view on whether musicality was in some way, culturally selected for.
That's a very interesting one. I've never really thought about musicality. Partly because, although my mother called me Cecilia after the patron saint of music in the hope that I would prove to be musical, alas, she was deeply disappointed in that. So I haven't taken a scholarly interest in musicality. I mean, I think in a way it would be an easy target for a cultural evolutionary analysis. I think, there were some recent studies, weren't there, of drumming in one species of primate. So I think it's quite possible that in common with some other animals, that we genetically inherit some kind of rhythmic capacity, and that then there is cultural evolution from that very small seed to the highly elaborated musical cognition, musical appreciation that we see across the world in very different forms. So I suppose that would be analogous to the case of literacy. I mean, there's definitely something genetically inherited related to reading and writing, which is our capacity to perceive small differences between objects. If we didn't genetically inherit that perceptual capacity, it would be impossible to learn to read. We wouldn't be able to tell one letter from another. And I think there may be something similar with musicality. There's some basic rhythmicity shared with other animals. And then in the human case, that has been greatly elaborated, and possibly for cheesecake reasons. I mean, possibly, the selection pressure might have been similar, but operating not on genetic variants, but on cultural variants.
Yeah, I suppose we've developed to build on your analogy there, we've developed an ability to know small differences in pitch as part of our communication, part of our evolutionary pressures on communication, and then we just build on that to turn it into music. Okay.
Yes.
I've got another question too, but I'll let the others ask first, and if this time I'll ask them the question later.
Okay.
Cecilia, can I come in with a test for me, if I've understood you correctly? You can tell me if I haven't. Are you proposing basically now 3 categories? We do have instincts, but very primitive and very sort of a small scope. In a social context, within cultural evolution, we evolve gadgets, yeah, and then cultural factors, cultural objects of selection are a 3rd level. Is that correct?
Yes, that you've certainly got the 2 key distinctions there. So I think, there are quite a few people, I mean, including Boyd and Richardson and Joe Henrich, saying that, tools and instruments, technology, but also specific beliefs are shaped by cultural evolution, sometimes cultural selection.
Yeah.
And I agree with them about that, but kind of that's not my thing. I'm saying it goes deeper than that. So I think what they do is they suppose that classical evolutionary psychology was right about the mental equipment, as it were, that we genetically inherit the special human ways of thinking. And then using those special human ways of thinking, we're able to have cultural evolution of tools and beliefs and so on. And I'm saying goes even deeper. The mental tools which make the cultural evolution of tools and beliefs and techniques and so on, that is itself a product of cultural evolution.
Okay, great. Thank you. Marion, do you want to come in? Hi, Marion.
Yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't able to see your slides. I had screwed up something on my computer, but I did understand your talk, and I actually read your book on cognitive gadgets some years ago, so I'm not completely out of this. But I have a question, and I think most people in the Darwin Club would be on your side now rather than the traditional evolutionary psychology side. That's sort of the way most of us think about things. But what's going on in sociology is interesting. And I was wondering, is that different than what's going on in psychology? And it's this. In the American Sociological Association, there's a section, Evolution, Biology, and Society. And it tends to be populated by a range of people who at one extreme emphasize the genetic and at the other end emphasize the sociocultural. But what's going on with the genetic end of it these days is everybody is doing genome-wide association studies because there's obviously going to be variation. And since we have so much genome data now, people can look at people and look at their phenotypes and look at their genotypes en masse. And there's huge numbers of these studies being done. So I wonder, are psychologists and cognitive psychologists into genome-wide association studies at all?
Absolutely. I mean, there's the same great enthusiasm
Okay.
It may be tempered a little by the fact that you can do big science in psychology via brain imaging as well as via behavioral genetics. I think it's big science is the pull, I mean, partly because of the way that funding is allocated and how much easier it is to get promotions and procedures, positions, and so on, if you've made a lot of grant money. I'm afraid, I hope that doesn't sound cynical, but I'm not sure that either the enthusiasm for brain imaging or the enthusiasm for behavioral genetics is driven by the science so much as by the sociology of science. It's happening, but I gather Robert Plomin, who of course is a great nativist and a world-leading behavioral geneticist, assures me that even if those genome-wide association studies showed really strong genetic effects to explain the differences between individuals in a population, that would not in any way vindicate claims about the population level evolution of behavior control mechanisms. These are just, as it were, two different enterprises. There's two different things to be explained, as it were, variation between individuals on the one hand, and change over time within a population of the average character of the cognitive mechanism. So I think there's a lot of people thinking that, genome-wide association studies, to the extent that they show genetic heritability, are supporting classical evolutionary psychology. And at one time I thought so too, but I think it's not so. They are two different enterprises.
Well, even cultural transmission evolution includes variation too. I don't know that variation makes a difference between the two points of view. It's that the genome-wide association studies correlate that variation with genetic differences. And that's,
but they almost never tell you what the endophenotype is. So you might have something like, I don't know, I'll make an absurd example, but there are close to equally absurd examples in the literature. You look at the kind of bank account that people have, which bank it's with, whether it's a savings account, whether it's a checking account, whether it gives you cash back. And then you look for genetic variation that correlates with that. You might well find it, but it's not going to be that you've got genes for banking. It'll be that you've got genes, the function of which in some environments does lead to variation in banking behavior. But an interesting question for a psychologist is, what was the function of those genes and what do they actually do to the development of the mind, which one of the consequences of which is to lead to a difference in banking behavior. But I think behavioral genetics just doesn't even ask those kinds of questions. It treats it as if you've got genes for banking.
Thank you.
Yamalam.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. Very stimulating.
Thank you.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on Jeff's question and your response to it, which seems to suggest to me that if you take cultural evolution seriously, which I certainly do, maybe a bit more in the traditional Boyd and Richardson or Joe Hendricks sense, but and I listened to you, and you have very a compelling story. You seem to be moving, and this is also how you responded to Jeff, the role of cultural evolution, or you seem to be putting the role of cultural evolution more central in such a way that you're moving back the role of genetic inheritance. And my question would then be, where exactly, but it makes sense that if you want to push back on what has been the ingrained view that you sort of state a strong case. But how far exactly would you be moving back the role of genetic inheritance and this instinct notion, especially in the light of human universals? So my sense is that you're moving it so far back that it's a certain cognitive, very basic cognitive functions that we have, out of which then the instruments are constructed, as you say. If you're moving it that far back, what, if any, would still be the explanation that you would give for certain human universals like cooperative tendencies that are really widespread, but there's many other universals I guess that you could take as an example. Do you have any explanation for those universals, or would you deny them, or is there a cultural explanation for that?
No, a very good question. Thank you for that. I wouldn't deny that there are universals, and the us being a hyper cooperative species, when you contrast us with other species apart from the social insects, and they obviously have their own explanation. And it's that slide, since we've still got the slides up, let me show that one again. In a way, this is answering the question of how far back I would push it. I would say, the changes that genetic evolution has made to our temperaments, to our attention, and to our general purpose cognitive mechanisms are at the root of human universals. So in the case of hyper-cooperation, our heightened social tolerance. I mean, Sarah Hrdy used a beautiful example of this. She said, look, imagine a group of humans sitting on an aeroplane on the tarmac waiting to take off, and it's delayed, and we all, on the whole, politely sit there in really close proximity, really very unhappy about the situation and feeling that everyone else is too close by, but we put up with it. We tolerate the proximity of all those other people. And she says, if this was chimpanzees, there would be rivers of the blood in the aisle within minutes under those conditions. So we're less irascible. We're less reactively aggressive to one another than our hominin ancestors were. That's what the contrast with chimpanzees implies. We're also highly socially motivated. I think social rewards are more rewarding, as it were, per unit. A social reward matters much more to us than it does to chimpanzees. I mean, I think Mike Tomasello has some nice observations on this. They just gave their chimpanzees the opportunity to eat together or to eat separately. There was a wire between them, so there couldn't be any stealing of food. And if you put humans under those conditions, they tend to sit quite close to one another. Whereas with chimpanzees, no interest in just being together. I think maybe a better illustration is studies of contingency that human babies find. If you put your hand in the cot and you move your hand every time the baby moves, you're not touching it, you're not stroking it, you're just making sure that the movements of your hand are contingent upon, predictable by the movements of the babies. The baby absolutely loves it. Just that social responsiveness is very rewarding for humans. So I would say it's these kinds of tweaks that have been made by genetic evolution that contribute to the universals, and common problems, as it were. I mean, all humans have very similar physical capabilities. We're relatively weak in a number of ways physically. We're confronting quite similar social coordination problems and quite similar physical environments. And that convergence, for me, is sufficient to explain the universals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Following on from that, Cecilia, could we discuss more specifically a morality? Because there's a number of people, including Pinker and others, who talked about moral dispositions as well. And you've given that example of refuting that video experiment with very young infants. But is there still a basis to say that, like studies of chimpanzees suggested there were pre-moral elements in chimpanzee behavior, like some reciprocity, some concern for sharing on a limit, albeit on a very limited scale. And people like Frans de Waal said, well, this is the basis of evolution much more extensively of morality in humans. Is there still some mileage in that story?
I don't think there is. I mean, Frans and I locked horns many times in the course of his life. And my feeling, although I haven't looked at it recently, but the last time I looked at it closely, which is now about 10 years ago, the non-human primate literature on sharing and fairness and that kind of thing looked to me as if it was all explicable by reinforcement learning, that, you know, it's proved more rewarding to share in the animal's past, and that therefore that it's instrumental, not intrinsically motivated, but instrumental. I mean, what I've concerned myself with more is the origins of empathy. And I do have a study which looks at human infants, non-human animals, robots, as well as adult humans, and the evidence relating to where empathy, the capacity to, as it were, feel with another person, comes from. And I think that itself is learned, as it were, that we experience emotions in the company of others experiencing the same emotion. And as a consequence of that kind of Pavlovian experience of feeling it while seeing it on the face or hearing it in the cry of another person, then seeing the face and hearing the cry develops, you know, acquires the capacity to activate the same feeling in ourselves. Now, that's not the sole root of human altruism. I think human altruism involves a good deal more of a more sophisticated cognitive kind than that. But I think that's something we share with other animals, that empathy, or what you might call emotional contagion. I see another creature experiencing something, and then I feel a matching feeling. I think we've got that in common with a wide range of other animals, and that we all learn it.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Anybody else like to come in? Is Yamalum again? And then after that, Johan.
Yeah,
So-
great. Yeah, I was just coming in again because I didn't see any other hands, and I have another few questions that I think may be interesting to discuss. So my previous one was about the universals and where you would draw the line. Another thing that I've always been quite central to my own thinking in evolutionary terms about our sociality and our ability to cooperate is the role of between group competition. So not the naive group selection stuff from the 60s, but more the multi-level selection type of arguments. And for me, that has always been an important part of thinking about the role of cultural evolution. But there are, of course, also their claims that this sort of multi-level process has led to some human universals in terms of cooperation. So my question is, if when I listen to you, it seems to be very much a story about the individual level and the developmental trajectory at the individual level. And you seem to have an important role on one of your slides about the teachers, the teachers that draw more students. I thought that was a really interesting part. makes it also very agentic in the sense that we may be sort of biased towards certain people that can draw our attention better. But all of that is relatively at the individual level, or maybe at the diet with the teacher. What about any role for between group cultural selection in your story?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I'm a psychologist, and I'm not even a social psychologist. So I am used to thinking about the individual. And, you know, in a way, I'm trying to replace classical evolutionary psychology, which was also focused on the individual. But of course, you're right that any kind of cultural evolutionary hypothesis needs population thinking, not just at the level of individuals. I mean, about all I can offer is that I do tend to think that group selection is probably a major driver of the cultural evolution of cognitive processes. So say you've got a group which is predicting behavior in a special way. Their way is really good at predicting behavior. That group might outcompete another group which has a run-of-the-mill way of predicting behavior in conflict, because they may be better able to anticipate the enemy's maneuvers, that kind of thing. That's one engine for group selection in this context. It could be that a particular cognitive variant promotes thriving of a group. They work more effectively together, and therefore they're better able to kind of survive and get their nutrients and so on. And that attracts a lot of immigration to the group. And then after a lot of immigration, there's going to be kind of fission of the group into two groups and so on. I mean, I wouldn't want to rule out that the cultural evolution of cognitive mechanisms also happens within groups. And in a way, that diagram that I showed you with the orange and the blue was within group spread. But I think probably the group level is pretty important. The multi-level selection models, I'm quite a big fan, you know, of David Sloan Wilson's work on this and Elliot Sober's and that kind of thing. I think to the extent that it assumes innate modes of thought, that's just a kind of intellectual modesty, saying, well, you know, we're not psychologists, and there's a lot of very prominent psychologists out there, originally led by Cosmides, Tooby, and Pinker, who are telling us that this stuff is genetically inherited. So we'll take their story on that. I don't think they're arguing for it or that it's important to their logic.
Thanks. Thank you.
Peter, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me. My internet connection is weak. I'm in the mountains in Switzerland. Can you hear me?
Lucky you. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when you talked about imitation, that the traditional views on imitation don't work, I couldn't hear you. But I also wanted to know is what in your own view, it seems to me there's a lot of learning going on, right? From between individuals. So what is your take on on imitation? And I apologize, I didn't hear what you said when I thought you took it down somehow.
Yeah. Well, what I said about imitation was that it's the primary evidence that it's a genetically inherited capacity has broken down. You know, you may have heard these stories about how newborns can copy facial expressions and copy hand movements and so on. And, you know, now a big study has shown that that's not the case.
Okay.
But I think I see your point. I'm postulating an awful lot of, if not specifically imitation, then social learning. And where does the potential for that come from? And I'm saying it's genetically inherited. So it's culturally inherited. Sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, we're born with a capacity for basic associative learning. You can use associative learning to learn from other agents as well as to learn from the inanimate environment. But that, along with our high social tolerance and motivation, our attentional biases towards other agents, these ingredients are then mixed into special forms of social learning through interaction with other people. And those special forms of social learning you could call forms of cultural learning. They're kind of higher varieties of social learning not found in other animals. They allow cultural inheritance of sufficient fidelity to get cultural evolution off the ground. And that would include imitation, being able to copy the details of body movements. It would involve the kind of strategic social learning where you don't just do what you see, you make a kind of a careful choice of models, which one will I copy and when should I copy rather than rely on my own resources to solve a problem. That kind of strategic social learning, I think, is concocted from these elements of the starter kit, these genetically inherited ingredients, through social interaction in childhood.
Great, thank you. I would also appreciate if you perhaps later on or so, I'd like to read a little bit more on current views on how learning takes place, right? Because I think, clearly that's absolutely core, right, for understanding cultural evolution. So getting a little bit, perhaps you can point us to some readings we can do, which, is consistent with your views, but spell out a little bit, you already are painting several different mechanisms, right? So I would love to read more on this.
I can only recommend my book from 2018, which was pretty accessible, and it was not, I mean, I think Mike Tomasello's books are great, but the way that Mike writes the book is to show you his vision of, human evolution and so on. That wasn't the way I wrote the book. I sort of said, this group of people believe this and this group of people believe that, and can we find evidence which favors one over another? So in a way, it gives you the intellectual landscape. And in case you don't have time for a book, I also wrote a précis of that book, which appeared in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences. So that's a quicker read.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Fine.
Well, thank you very much indeed. There's no more questions, but I'm sure there's a lot of thinking going on silently. Cecilia, that was really wonderful. I'm very stimulated by the implications of this, and we'll have to think about it a lot more. I hope you'll be able to join us on future discussions, because it's been a great discussion too. Thanks to the other participants. On behalf of everyone, I want to thank you most warmly for your talk and for engaging with us in this way. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed it too.
That's terrific. I'll be in touch with you.
Lovely. Bye-bye.